Hello, welcome back. My name is Ari and today we are going to do my 1980s wrap up. Alright, so 1980s. I was a little bit scared going into this month or decade, I guess, of reading because the 1970s were so messed up. Like, that was traumatic. But the 1980s proved to be a whole lot less problematic than the 1970s. Thank God. So let's just jump in. The first book from 1981 is An Indecent Obsession by Colleen McCullough. And this is a romance. I for some reason associate like historical romances with the 1980s, and I was expecting to get a paperback, but for some reason when I ordered this it came in as a hardback and I was immensely disappointed to start out with. The subject matter in this book is also immensely disappointing. This takes place in World War II, but the Australian front instead of like the Western front. So these take place in like islands around Japan. And it is the very end of the war, and there are a group of men in a hospital because the Australian military doesn't want to discharge them, but they can't be in combat because of various mental disorders that they have. Most of it involving some sort of PTSD because of the war. But there's other things, but they're all like mentally unstable men due to the horrors that they've seen during war. And it covers this group of men and the nurse that cares for them. And to start out with, that's just automatically problematic. Like, you can't have a romance about mentally unstable people. That's not a good recipe for romance, because the nurse is always going to be in a position where she has power and influence over these men, and it would be like a grooming situation or a otherwise like inappropriate relationship because of her power and their mental instabilities. There are some like really problematic things going on in this book. There's like a scene in here where like the woman, and I quote, I'm like reading from the book right now, of course she knew as well as he that in consenting to meet him here, she was also consenting to whatever liberties he planned to take. Consenting to meet up with a man does not mean you consent to be raped or to have sex with him. Like, you can meet with a man and not want to have sex with him and still say no. And that's just problematic. There is some inappropriate comments about homosexuality in this, which the 80s was a big part of the AIDS epidemic, and there was a lot of fear and misinformation around homosexual men. So that's unfortunately expected, but nevertheless not appropriate. Overall, this does not have a good view on women, does not have a good view on mental health, and does not have a good view on homosexuality, and the overall plot of the story was not good enough to make up for all of those failures. So, do not recommend it. I didn't like it. The next book on this list I don't have a physical copy of, but it was The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This book is the story of a woman of color in the rural South as in like North, or the USA South. And this is told as a series of letters, starting out to God at first, and then later they're letters to her sister. There are also letters from her sister in this story, but it all is like letters, but kind of reads like a diary because it's letters to God. So instead of Dear Diary, it's Dear God. This is dark, but very powerful. The opening letter of the book, like literally page 1 of the book, the main character is 13 years old and she is being raped by her father. And that is a hell of a way to start a book. And it just basically, like, this woman has a horrible life, but she makes the best of her life as she possibly can. There is a sapphic relationship in here, which is a very interesting thing to explore. The main character is bisexual, but she leans more towards being a lesbian because of trauma she's faced from men in her life. And it's just, overall, it's a really, really powerful book. It's not a book that I can say is good because it's so depressing, but it is definitely very, very powerful. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do. All right, next up for 1983, I read Who Killed the Robbins Family by Bill Adler and Thomas Chaston. This is a weird but cool little book. I don't know if you can see this banner on the book right here, but the purpose of this book is this is a mystery where in each chapter members of the Robbins family are killed, and it's not like all like one weekend event or any sort of like close isolated type of murder anything, but it's over many years and it's different people from the Robbins family being killed. There are the mother, father, and then 6 children. And throughout the fairly short book, everybody dies eventually. And there is a contest where people in 1984 had to write in and say, like, who, what, where, when, why, and how that all of these murders took place. Some of them are very obvious, like you know exactly who died and where they died. You may not know who killed them, but like some of the answers, like the how, a lot of times it tells you on page like exactly how that person died, though sometimes it doesn't. And then the person who came up with the best answers, even though you weren't required to be like 100% accurate, would win $10,000. This copy is the 1984 copy and does not have the answers in it, but they're very easy to find online, so I did go through and read all the answers, and I suck at guessing the mystery in these things. I got 1 right. So there's that. I at least got 1 right. The author did say in the answers that one was purposefully made very obvious and easy so everybody could feel like they got something, which didn't help. But at least I got the easy one. This is really for fans of murder mystery novels because a lot of the clues in here are references to famous murder mystery stories. So if you had read like all of Agatha Christie, then you would kind of get the hint of that Agatha Christie novel in this book and then remember how that turned out and be like, oh, I know what this is hinting at. I don't really read that many murder mysteries, so I didn't get that. Overall, I thought it was really cute. It wasn't like the greatest thing I've ever read, but I did enjoy my time with this, and I think if you like murder mysteries, then you would enjoy this a lot more than I did. Alright, if you can hear my fan in the background, I am sorry. It is just way, way too hot to record without it on. I am so sweaty, I feel like I'm going to faint. So I had to turn it on. I'm sorry for any noises in the background, but it is what it is. Next up for 1984 is Legend by David Gemmell, and this is a high fantasy, and it kind of fits along the lines of what you would assume is a typical high fantasy in like the 1980s, 1990s, where there's a lot of battles. Like, this entire book is literally about one battle. There's not a whole lot of magic in this book, but it's very battle heavy, and then it's considered a high fantasy because it is obviously not Earth realm where this takes place. Very medieval fantasy as well, where they're in a castle, a horde of barbarians who outnumbers the inhabitants of this castle 500 to 1 are attacking, and the castle has the castle has 6 walls, and the men in this castle need to hold off the invading barbarians for as long as they possibly can, while the king sends reinforcements. And the reinforcements are going to take months because they need to be gathered and trained, because this land has not seen any sort of war or battle in 25-30 years, which means the heroes from the last war are all dead except for one man named Druss, and he is known as Druss the Legend, which is where the name comes from of the book. Now, Druss is like 60, 70 years old, and he has never lost a battle, but he's an old man, and his goal in life is he wants to die in battle. He does not want to die sick in bed. He doesn't want to waste away. He wants to fall in battle, and that would be the conclusion of his life. So he comes out to this outpost castle to lead this army and be their legendary warrior. And it follows him and other people who are to become like the heroes of their generation. And just having a hero protagonist in his like 60s or 70s is just one of, like, it was awesome. It was awesome to read about. There are female heroes as well as male heroes. And it's awesome. One thing that I kind of need when I read fantasy like this, that I like prefer, is an author who is not afraid to kill off his heroes. And David Gemmell is not afraid to murder people that you think are like main parts of this story. I mean, he keeps obviously some heroes alive because it's a series and we need to continue on, but there is not a lot of fear in murdering people. So that was cool. I really enjoyed this. This is a 5-star read for me, and I am so looking forward to reading the rest of this series, and I'm kind of mad that I'd never read this fantasy series before now. So 5 stars, fantastic. If you like medieval fantasy that's very battle heavy, you'll probably like this book. Next up is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I think a lot of people have heard of this. I know I had to read this originally in college for a women's fiction class, and this is dark, dark shit. This is a story of, it's a post-apocalyptic story of the United States. I guess not post-apocalyptic, dystopian would be a better phrase. This is a dystopian book based in the United States, and the US government has fallen and been replaced by a society called Gilead, and this is a very, very fundamental religious society, fundamental Christian society is how I would put it. And women are placed in a slave-like subservient state. And different women have different classes based off of their social standing and how pure they are, and have to dress different ways depending on those social classes. So you have the wives, which are rich men's wives. Then you have Marthas, which are like housekeeper type things. Middle class, like, wives are like multifaceted. They're like a wife and a Martha, so they care for the house and they have babies and things like that. And then you have like sisters, who are like the women's form of government. And then you have the handmaids, who wear red, which you can see on the cover. Handmaids are women who are known to be able to have children, and they are given to a wealthy man and his wife and ceremoniously raped in order to get pregnant, have a child. The child will be given to the wife and her commander husband, and then she will be moved to a different family to repeat this entire process. The women who become handmaids are not only women who are known to be fertile, they are also women who, when America was still the United States of America, were known to be promiscuous, so had multiple sexual partners, had a child out of wedlock, lived with a man out of wedlock. Like, this is a very dark dystopia where women are not treated well. And the scary thing about this book is you can picture something like this, like, legitimately happening. The fear that led to this dystopia was birth rates were plummeting, just because women were using birth control and just didn't want to have babies. They chose not to just have babies, and then chemicals in the air and water were dropping birth rates, which is something that happens. Like, there's no fear right now of like any sort of population control or like shrinking population, because there's a lot of people out there and we still have plenty of babies. But that's kind of like the fear in this society, is like something in the air and water has made it where it's much harder for women to get pregnant, and when they do get pregnant they miscarry at a much, much higher rate, or have like stillbirths or like life-ending deformities to the children at birth. And it's dark. It's really, really good, but it's dark. But this is basically told in a way where the handmaid that is the main character of this book, her name is Ofred, is her name, and that is like of Fred. So the commander that she belongs to is named Fred, so her name is Ofred. And if she goes to another commander's house, her name will change to like of George or something like that. And that's how dark this shit is like these women don't even have their own names. They're just known as of a man's name, and change every time that she is raped again. It's dark. Anyway, the handmaid, you know from the beginning that she is attempting escape, and as she is attempting this escape, she is recording these tapes to basically like, this is what I went through, this is why Gilly needs to fall. And these were found like 2,000 years later or something like that. But dark, dark shit. If you haven't read this and you aren't like, don't like have triggers on rape or anything like that, or female harm, death, murder, anything like that, I definitely recommend reading this. I also read the sequel to this that came out last year, which was The Testaments, which reads in a very similar vein, except for it has like 3 different main characters instead of just the one main character. And then the main characters are women in other points of the society and not necessarily handmaids. Next up for 1986 is Watchmen by Alan Moore, and then illustration by Dave Gibbons. This is a graphic novel, and it is a very dark graphic novel. This is the first graphic novel that I've actually like enjoyed, so I will definitely be reading more by Alan Moore, just because I apparently like dark things. Like this isn't new. We all know that I like dark, depressing things. Anyway, this is basically about masked superheroes, like Batman, but instead of being like a wonderful save the world moral high ground type of hero like Batman is, these masked heroes are normal people with the flaws and like problems of normal people. So some of these people are assholes, even though they're vigilantes and they try to like take down criminals. They're not necessarily good people. The masked vigilantes have been outlawed for many years, and it's kind of like these people trying to figure out like what they're going to do with their lives now that they can't be masked vigilantes, but then they still feel like the government is corrupt and not doing enough, and that masked vigilantes are needed. And it's just kind of like the moral crises and everything with the masked vigilantes and different fluctuation points in their lives and how they feel about being like masked vigilantes. And I enjoyed it a lot. It's dark. If you've watched the movie, I think the movie is fairly accurate towards the comic book. I would still recommend reading the comic, but if you're not really into reading and you just want to watch the Watchmen movie, I would say that was perfectly acceptable. For 1987, I read Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe by Fanny Flagg. Now this one, it's mostly stuff that I am not interested in as far as it's like a contemporary slice of life type thing. This is told in a very interesting like mixed timeline where the main character, what is her name? A middle-aged woman named Evelyn goes every weekend to a nursing home with her husband to visit her mother-in-law, who she doesn't particularly like and doesn't like her back. So while her husband is spending time with his mother, she starts to like wander around the nursing home and meets a Mrs. Threadgood, who builds a friendship with Evelyn and basically like tells her like all of the interesting stories of growing up in Whistle Stop and her friends and family in that area and like all of the stuff they get up into. And so Mrs. Threadgood's telling her these stories, and you'll hear like Miss Threadgood telling the story to Evelyn, and then you'll get a next chapter that's actually like really what happened and not just how Miss Threadgood perceived the story, but like actually what happened in that point of the story. So this jumps around between like the 1930s to like the 1980s. And there's no like, it's not in like chronological order. You'll go from like the 80s to the 30s to the 60s to the 40s to the 80s again. It's like, it's all over the place. It's a really cool look at just like Southern history. Now, This is equal parts like problematic and fantastically modern at the same time. There is a sapphic relationship and a I would say even like a trans character. There is a person in this book named Iggy who was born as a woman and identifies with like she, her pronouns, but she dresses like a man. She's in a sapphic relationship where she is the man of the relationship. She is in like all male clubs and she's mostly treated like a man, even though she is acknowledged to be like biologically born as a woman. And this is the 1930s in the US South, and she is treated with like respect, which is awesome. It is also the 1930s in the American South, so black people are not treated well. There's also like questions of like disabilities and things like that. So it's like back and forth where like some concepts are treated really well and some aren't. Evelyn, even in the 1980s, is overweight, and there is a whole lot of like internalized fat shaming and like talk about like going to a fat farm to change her life and how she's overweight and needs to be skinny and stuff like that, which isn't necessarily like the best way to handle an overweight character. It doesn't read as horrible to me because it's mostly internalized, and like women like Mrs. Threadgood are like, oh honey, I don't think you're fat, like you look fine, you look healthy. But Evelyn is very concerned about her own weight and what she eats and stuff like that. So there's also like a lot of slut shaming, and there's conversations in the book that Evelyn kind of internally monologues where she's like, why do all the worst insults have to do with being a woman? Why is a man who's considered less than manly a pussy? Or why is like cunt, like a women's genitalia, considered such an offensive word? Why do men tell women that they're sluts even though like at the same time that they're like cheating on their wives, they call their wife a slut, or girlfriend a slut, or women in general sluts, even though they're the ones who are doing the inappropriate behavior. There's a lot of interesting monologues around like women's power and women's rights in those contexts. So good parts, bad parts, but overall really good. There's also recipes in the back of this book for like southern cooking. Like there's 2 recipes for fried green tomatoes in here, and then like fried chicken or cornbread, or what else do we got? Buttermilk biscuits, pecan pie, like all sorts of fun stuff like that. Next up is the 3rd book in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series, which is The Queen of the Damned. Interview with the Vampires first, then The Vampire Lestat, and then this one. This one is told from Lestat's perspective, where Interview with a Vampire, which I read last month, was told from Louis' perspective. And I prefer Lestat's perspective over Louis'. You might notice that I skipped a book in there. I have already previously read The Vampire Lestat, so I didn't actually skip it. It's just I've already read it. Anyway, what can I say about this book? There is an interesting plot point in this book where the queen of all vampires wants to destroy mankind. And when I mean destroy mankind, I mean just the men. Like, her goal is to let 1 out of every 100 men live for breeding purposes until women scientists can come up with an artificial insemination, like, guarantee. But other than that, it's just her perspective is that men are the cause of war and humanity will be better off without men. And it argues both like for and against the things with very interesting commentary from both perspectives, where obviously killing all the men in the world is a bad idea, but having the argument heard from a semi-logical perspective is still a very, very interesting thing to read. I can also say that the soundtrack to the movie that was based off of this book is one of my favorite soundtracks of all time, and the movie itself was one of the worst movies I've seen in my entire life. So don't ever watch that movie. Alright, the next book up is The next book up for 1989 is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, and based off of my normal reading preferences, there is nothing about this book that I should like. Like, the concept of this book seems so incredibly boring. It is a butler, an English butler, after World War II, is told by his employer to take a week's vacation. And he decides to drive for 6 days across England. And you have to imagine at this time, like, in the 1950s, cars did not move very fast, and he's still setting like a very leisurely pace. But he drives for 6 days across England, and it's kind of a mix of this trip that he's taking and then him reflecting on his life and what he's done with his life, and like kind of being confronted with regrets of his life choices as he's hitting his twilight years. Ishiguro is just such an amazing writer that he somehow makes that concept interesting. And the butler is just such a socially awkward character. And even though he is the narrator of this story and he is like remembering these events, they're told in a way where the reader can pick up on these context clues that you realize that he was being like socially ignorant in this situation where maybe like a woman was flirting with him, or she was like obviously having like a bad day, or obviously saw something wrong with like the way his employer handled something, and you can both tell like what the acceptable response in that situation should have been, and that the butler just didn't get it. One example, which is a little bit spoilery, but it's not like a main part of the story, is his former employer was a Nazi sympathizer before and during World War II, and because his friends recommended it, he told the butler to fire all of the Jewish women working for him. And he went to go tell the lead housekeeper that she needed to let these chambermaids go because they were Jewish, because the butler is in charge of the men of the household and the housekeeper is in charge of the women of the household. And she's trying to explain to him like how wrong firing these women because they're Jewish is, and how she's not okay with him doing this. And he's just like, well, that's what the master wants. Like, I don't have any problem with Jewish people, but the master said that I needed to fire them, so we're gonna fire them. And just like the fact that he like misses this entire situation, and you can see his ignorance of the social, like of her like social cues, and her frustration with knowing that he just does not understand her, is just amazing to read. And that's basically what the entire book is him being socially ignorant, and the people around him just being like, why are you like this, dude? But very, very enjoyable. It was pretty short, and even if you don't really like contemporary, if you like character studies of like awkward characters, I think you would very much like this. I have loved everything I've read by Ishiguro, so I will continue to read more by him. And the final book for 1990 was The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, and this is the first book in Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, which is a 14-book epic fantasy series where like every book is like 600 to 1,000 pages. This is a reread. This is probably like the 20th time I've reread this book, and I enjoy it every single time I read it. I very, very much enjoy this specific book. I have a love-hate relationship with the series overall. I like books 1 through 6. In book 6, my favorite scene of the entire series happens. Then 7 to like 11, I would say. Yeah, 7 to 11. The story is very slow, very draggy. It's going on too long. I got very sick of it. And then after book 11, Robert Jordan died, but he knew he was dying. So he took very extensive notes on how to finish his stories, his books out, so like the world would get a completion to the series, and then asked his wife, who was his editor, to finish the story. She didn't feel comfortable finishing the story and hired Brandon Sanderson to finish the story, and Brandon Sanderson is my all-time favorite author. So the 3 books that Brandon Sanderson wrote for the story, I loved the first 2, and the final book was mostly good until you got to the actual ending, and the ending of the series is the worst thing I have ever read. So it's like book 1 through 6 gets 5 stars, then it goes down to a 3 stars, then it goes back up to like 5 stars for 12 and 13, and then 14 is a 1 star. Like, this is a roller coaster of a series. So I don't know that I actually like recommend this to anybody. But this is basically a universe with a chosen one trope, but there's like a fate system in the series where the lives of every character, or the lives of every human being, are wove into the pattern by the Wheel of Time. And every book in the series starts the same way, where it's like the Wheel of Time turns and ages come into past, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten by the time the age that gave it birth comes again. So there are ages, and you know there is at least 4 ages, but I think there's like a compendium guide with it that tells you like how many ages. I just don't remember. But this takes place in the 3rd age. So the 2nd age, which was the age before this, is the Age of Legends, where powerful magic users known as Aes Sedai, of both male and female, just created miracles basically throughout the world. And then at the end of the Age of Legends, the Dark One, who is like a I mean, a dark one, that's a normal trope. Like an evil being. You've got the creator and the dark one, and the dark one is trying to escape and destroy the world. And the dark one broke out of his prison during the Age of Legends, and the Aes Sedai had to work together to trap the Dark One back in his prison to save the world. And as the Dark One was trapped, he like threw something back at the moment he was trapped that poisoned the male half of the source, or it's called Satan, and any man who can use the power to do magic eventually becomes completely insane. And all of these male magic users destroyed the world. It was called the Breaking because they're powerful magic users and they all went crazy, and basically destroyed everything around them. So that was the end of the Second Age, and now this is in the Third Age, and it's hundreds of years, thousands of years afterwards, where all of the events of the Age of Legend are just myth at this point, and the magic users are only female, they're not nearly as strong as they used to be, and it's kind of going from like a modern age like we have now, and then reverting back to like a middle age of like peasantry and lacking technology. And one of the legends or prophecies of Third Age is that Louis Theron who is known as the Dragon, will be reborn, and he will both save and destroy the world. And then that's basically what the Wheel of Time is about, is the new coming of the dragon. Good and bad. If you really, really like fantasy, you've probably already read this, so I don't know that I'd really recommend it to anybody, but I wouldn't not recommend it to people either. That's everything for the 1980s. I ended up reading like 30 books this month, so the other 20 books that I read will be covered on Saturday in the next video, and I will see you then.